Alright, so in the last video we learned what an imaginary number is, that they have real and imaginary components. Let's see why this is helpful. Let's take the equation x squared plus 1 equals 0. And let's solve for this, meaning we're trying to find what x is. Remember that solutions are also x-intercepts. Let's graph this to see this visually. If I were to graph this equation, I see that my vertex would be up here, and it opens upward. This graph looks like this. So if I asked you what the solutions were, you would think, okay, what are the x-intercepts? And you'd say there's no solution. It doesn't cross the x-axis. So there's no solution. However, starting today, now that we understand imaginary numbers, we're not going to say no solution anymore. There's no real solution, but there are two imaginary solutions. So quadratics always have at least two solutions. But they may be real, they may be imaginary. So let's go ahead and solve this algebraically to see the imaginary solutions. So first I'd subtract 1. I get x squared equals negative 1. So this is saying what number squared is negative 1? Well, that's tough because there's no number times itself that's going to be negative. Right? If you took negative 1 and multiplied that by negative 1, you don't get negative 1, you get positive 1. Any number squared is going to be positive. Well, we've developed a number I that helps us deal with this. So if I take the square root of both sides, we write x equals plus or minus the square root of negative 1, and the square root of negative 1 is what we call I. So our two answers are positive I and negative I. So let's discuss what this I means. I, by definition, is equal to the square root of negative 1. Once again, I is just the square root of negative 1. This is important that we understand what I represents. Now, something else that's important is what I squared is. I squared is equal to the square root of negative 1 squared. Well, when I square a square root, those cancel. So I squared is equal to negative 1. That is another really important definition. I is the square root of negative 1. I squared equals negative 1.